Welcome to Harmony Talk, conversations with individuals who dream big and follow through, sometimes against great odds. This podcast is brought to you by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business that celebrates and promotes dreamers and doers. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau, and our guest today is Lisa Depaulo, an award-winning writer from northeastern Pennsylvania. Lisa, whose career spanned the heyday of glossy magazines, think Vogue and Vanity Fair, reported on some of the highest profile cases of the last century and had a front row seat at George magazine. She worked directly with its founder, John F. Kennedy Jr. And now with the release of the FX series Love Story, a dramatization of the whirlwind romance and tragic deaths of JFK Jr. and his wife, Carolyn Bessette, Lisa finds herself back in the cultural conversation. Writing for The Hollywood Reporter, Lisa looks at what happens when history is reimagined for a new generation. And the lines between truth and myth are once again called into question. Lisa joins us from her home in Philadelphia. Welcome, Lisa. So good to have you.
It's great to be here. I love all our Northeast connections, right?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's where you come from the Scranton area, Dunmore in particular. So when did you know that journalism was something you wanted to do?
Gosh, according to my mother, always. I mean, I really never thought of anything else. I got to Penn. It wasn't exactly a J school, but it was a wonderful place to be. And yeah, I guess I just always wrote. The question was was I going to go work in magazines? And that's where I ended up.
But journalism is a particular kind of storytelling. So you didn't end up writing novels, for example.
No,
so there
I
must
wish I
have
had.
been. You did write an ebook, but there. Again, though, that was a true story. So I guess what I'm asking is, did you feel a calling to sort of promote the truth?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wish I could write a novel. It's just not how I'm wired. It's just journalism, facts, investigating stories is really who I am. I wish I could write fiction. And I know a lot of wonderful journalists who do. I've never been able to get my mind around that.
You had to tell the truth.
I try.
So, well, when you were working for Philly Magazine, which would be after you graduated from UPenn,
Yeah.
John F. Kennedy Jr., as I understand it, called you to work at George Magazine. And at first, I read that you didn't even believe it was him. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I got this message on my machine at Philly Mag, and it said, "Hi, it's John Kennedy. I want to talk to you. I want you to be part of the George family." So I walked out of my office and said, "Okay, who's the jerk?" I said more colorful words. And I said, "Who did this?" And everybody's looking at me because we had a lot of guys on staff who were pranksters,
Sure.
And there was one in particular who could mimic anyone. And I said, "Who did this?" "It's you, Corsello. I know it's you. It's you, Platt." And they were up just looking at me. But I thought and then a couple days later, I get this other message that says, "Hi, Lisa, it's John Kennedy again. I know you're really busy." Me?
Right.
"But can you call me back?" And this time he left the cell phone number. So I called him back and it was him.
Right. And what was it about you and your writing that drew him?
Well, a couple things, actually. Somebody brought to an editor's attention a story I had done on Ed Rendell, which was very controversial. I got a lot of crap for it. Basically because I had the temerity to report accurately what that man used to say, which the boys never did, quite frankly. And so I took a lot of grief for it here in Philly, but somehow it landed on the desk of George editors and John. And so that was one thing. And then I had my first assignment for George. He loved, and he just said, "This is the kind of thing I want in the magazine." And he signed me up as a contract writer. So it was really exciting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very exciting. It was a political satire kind of magazine.
Mhm.
I mean, Cindy Crawford dressed as George Washington graced the cover.
The covers were, yes. John he was ahead of his time. The melding of politics and celebrity and entertainment. Now you see it everywhere. I would argue the first thing we saw that really exemplified that was when Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall and played the sax. That was the 90s. And, John really got it. He was ahead of his time. So the cover, yes, was Cindy Crawford dressed as George Washington, or Drew Barrymore dressed as Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday, Mr. President.
Right.
John had a lot of guts. But inside that magazine, there was really hard reporting, great reporting, and a lot of fun stuff, like Madonna saying if I were president. It was a mix of pop culture and serious. And his theory, I think, was right. Like he wanted people to find politics accessible, to find it interesting, to find it, to not say political magazine and your eyes glaze over.
He wanted to engage people.
Yeah, absolutely engage people. And he did, and he knew what that right mix was.
Right. But did he have a discernible talent for actually, running and editing a magazine? Because he didn't really come from that background.
But he did. His mother became a huge editor at Doubleday. She edited wonderful books. His father started as a writer, as a journalist. Don't forget Profiles in Courage, which President Kennedy authored. So I would argue it ran in his blood, not the Kennedy family's blood, but Jackie and John F. Kennedy's blood. And he had a marvelous gift of knowing what a good story was, which to me is the sign of a great editor. He had a great curiosity. Was he a line editor? No. Like, did he,
right.
Add the comma?
Check the grammar. Right.
Right. But he would write marvelous things on the sides of this is back in the day where you printed it out. I'm old. Like,
no, you're not.
We weren't writing on caves, but it was close. And he would scribble on the manuscript, I love this, or let's talk about this. He got the big picture. And he was a wonderful editor in terms of, what good writers need? They don't need line editors. They need an editor who says, how is the reporting? What did he say? What do you think how do you think you want to do this story? Like, talk it out before the writing starts. He was wonderful at that.
Was there a particular story that you can retell us that you covered that he was really involved in?
One of my favorites was the very last thing. Well, actually, I'm going to tell you two.
Okay.
At one point, do you remember Dick Morris? You would remember. For everybody under 50. Dick Morris was Bill Clinton's guru. He was a political consultant that was, credited with Bill Clinton's reelection. Okay. He was his guy, his James Carville. He came after Carville. Carville got him elected. Dick got him reelected. Okay. Dick Morris crashed and burned in the course of a scandal where he was found sucking on the toes of a prostitute on the balcony of the Jefferson Hotel in Washington. The pictures were taken. They were on the front page of the National Enquirer. And poor Dick Morris, who was a very smart and gifted man, he was driven out of the business in shame. Shame. And while I was at George, Dick was trying to mount a comeback. And John said, I want you to do the story of Dick Morris mounting his comeback. And the way he was doing his comeback was he was going to run a campaign in Honduras. So John told me to go with Dick to Honduras. So everything's set up. I'm going with Dick Morris to Honduras. And the night before the flight, Dick calls me and he says, I can't do this. Because he was in a 12-step program for sex addiction.
Oh, and now he's going with a woman to Honduras. Okay.
Yeah. And he didn't think that was a great idea. And I was like, oh, please don't flatter yourself, Dick. But I said, I didn't know what to do. And he said, well, I can't do it. So I called John. I said, he's backing out. What should I do? He said, what step is he on? I said, I think 4. And he said, call him back and tell him, you can do this. You can get to step 5. I have faith in you. You can do this. And I did. And, and Dick said, you're right. I can do this. And it was back on. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I said, John, you're brilliant. It's back on. I said, is there any other advice you have? And he said, yeah, don't wear sandals.
Oh,
Don't
wouldn't
suck
want
any
any toe
lines.
licking going on there. Yeah.
But that was John. Okay.
Yeah.
And my other favorite time was when my very last story was a story about the mayor of Dunmore, my hometown, who I went to high school with. And that was John's idea because my mother was diagnosed with a horrible form of cancer. John said to me, go home, be with her. Don't worry about your stories. How many editors would do that? None. So he gave me that gift. So I was home and it was quick and cruel. It was a few months, but when I would come back to the office, of course, I kind of felt, do I want to talk to John Kennedy about my mother dying? So I would tell him funny stories about Dunmore and about the mayor and the little mayor who I went to high school with, who the first day I got there pulled up next to my car and said, Lisa, I know why you're in town. If you get any tickets at the Mercy Hospital, bring them to me. And I thought, oh my God. And John just loved this. He said, that's what a mayor is. I love this. And I said, John, if somebody has a pothole, they call Nibs and he fixes their pothole. So after my mother passed, I came back to New York. He said, I want you to write about your hometown. And I said, I don't want to write about me. And he said, not about you, about that little mayor. And I did this big profile of Dunmore through the eyes of Nibs Alotny, the mayor. And John called it the best little mayor in America. And he wrote about it in his editor's note, the last editor's note. So it means a lot to me. And it's one of my favorite stories I ever wrote because it was something that, wow, writing about that whole kind of small town wonderfulness, right?
And putting it on a national stage,
It
which
was so
was
great.
really, I'm sure a lot of
Yeah,
people related to it
it
in
was a lot.
small town politicians and so on, But
Exactly. And John, in his editor's note, said, this is what politics is for most people. Like the mayor is the person who helps them, makes their lives better, plows their streets, picks up their trash. That's politics. And it was a wonderful opportunity and a wonderful story. So that was him.
I think you've already sort of answered this question, but I'm going to ask it again anyway. Was there anything that JFK Jr. cared about or didn't care about, for that matter, that the public doesn't realize?
He cared about what mattered to people. He cared about, making politics accessible, he believed politics was a noble profession. And as his father did and his mother did. So in that sense, he carried the torch in a way that I thought was quite wonderful and admirable. I think most people saw John as a pretty great guy. He was a great guy. I don't think enough, can't say enough of how good a guy he was. I mean, Lisa, think about it. He could have been a real self-centered egotist. He wasn't any of those things. I mean, he was American royalty, came from a lot of money. You would never know that in dealing with John. He was so down to earth. So maybe that's what people should know. But also, this whole series,
Well, that's exactly where we're going with that. Sure.
Yeah, let's go to there. As my reviews in Hollywood Reporter probably show, I have very mixed feelings about this show. On one hand, I am thrilled that a new generation of people are learning about John and Carolyn. I have, nephews that are in their 30s that don't know much about them. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
I think it's terrific that this generation is being told about them. That
But what
said,
they are being told.
right, like, is it all accurate? You know, it's a mini series, and there's some outlandish things in this mini series that are not true. In the beginning, I thought the depiction of her was as a strong, smart, you know, that was very true, and I think John would have been very happy that she was presented that way.
Mhm.
Now the episodes are getting a little
She's
ugly.
getting a little whiny and a little.
Yeah.
But you have harsh criticism for the portrayals of the other characters of Jackie O and Daryl Hannah, for example.
The Jackie O depiction, and I love Naomi Watts. I think she's wonderful in the feud, the Truman Capote versus the Swans. She played Babe Paley magnificently. I hate her depiction of Jackie. It's there's one scene in particular where she, knows she's gravely ill, and she picks up a portrait of her husband, her assassinated husband, and dances with it to Camelot. And I just found that absurd. Like making her this comical, that was just absurd. And Daryl Hannah is portrayed as a total nitwit, as a total flake. And as I wrote in my review of that episode, I did not know the woman. I never met Daryl Hannah, but I guarantee you, John would have never spent 5 years with that character. He was drawn to smart, confident, together women. That's why he loved Carolyn. And Daryl Hannah, she wrote a wonderful column in the New York Times saying this was absurd and a disgrace that they did this to me. And she's never spoken about him in all these years. And that's how outraged she is. And guess what? Good for her.
Absolutely.
Good for her, But I felt the same way.
But the two main characters, that is the two actors, Sarah Pidgeon and Mr. Kelly, did they capture John and Carolyn a little bit for you at all, and how so?
Look, nobody looks like John Kennedy. Nobody in the entire planet looks like John Kennedy. I think this actor, he gets his mannerisms. Like there are moments where I say, "Oh my God, that's the way John moved.
Mm.
That's a John expression." He does. And then there are moments I'm like, "No, that doesn't look anything like him. It doesn't act, But I will give the actor credit for getting it right some of the time. And the same for Sarah Pidgeon, who plays Carolyn. She gets it right a lot of the time in the way Carolyn carried herself, the way she, and she was a very funny, great woman. She was just really sweet and great. You don't know that because a lot of the images people see are the face she has on when she's being chased by the paparazzi. And that was very difficult for her.
Well, there was a whole scene where she is very upset about Princess Diana's dying, who was, of course, chased by paparazzi into a tunnel. And John doesn't seem to, at least in the series, be affected as much as she is.
Well, that's completely false. John was really affected by it. We all were. I mean, I was terrified that they would be next. They were chased all the time. Now, and it's funny because in New York, celebrities usually aren't bothered. It's one of the reasons Jackie Kennedy moved to Manhattan. They aren't. But there was something about the two of them that, they were chasing her, really. And John was used to it. He grew up with this. But Carolyn wasn't used to it. And they would shout horrible profanities. You can imagine what kind. So when you see these photos of her, no, you wouldn't smile either. And they would do it to provoke her to get that response. It worked.
Well, they depict her also as never leaving the house, the loft, because of that. Did she actually sequester herself for like a year?
No. No, she went out. They went to things. They went to events. But it is definitely true that it became more and more painful for her to go outside. You know, it was never ending. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not in that position myself, but yeah. You're hounded every single time you walk out the door. It'd be awful.
It was really hard. It was really hard. He did handle it better.
But he also implied in the series, too, that she wasn't as supportive of George, but she was supportive of George, wasn't she?
Oh, totally. She was always, yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of crap. You know, she hung out in the art with the creative director, and she had great ideas for, especially aesthetically for the magazine. She had great taste. So that's a lot of bull. I guess they had to make her like put upon or whatever. That wasn't the case.
Well, regardless, this is a very popular series.
Absolutely. But I hope everybody's reading my reviews in the Hollywood Reporter, because I think they are a perspective that I think is, you're not going to get from other reviews.
John F. Kennedy Jr., he's kind of been mythologized. And so now you have this series that's trying to tell the truth, but upholds the myth. And you have young people going to restaurants that John and Carolyn frequented. They're buying John's hats, What kind of a picture are they actually getting of history, of George, of John and Carolyn?
As I said, a lot of it's very good. A lot of it's very good. And some of it's just, extreme. And, and I hope people are smart enough to know that this is a dramatized miniseries.
And this is not reality exactly.
Right. And if it were capturing their lives exactly as they were, you wouldn't tune in, because people's lives, day-to-day lives, aren't full of drama. So they're focusing on a lot of things that are, I think, grossly exaggerated. But I also feel like, ew, it's also ick. Like, what they did in private, I don't want to know. I'm just a little, the last episode is going to be the plane crash, and I don't want to watch it.
But you probably have to for the Hollywood Reporter.
I do.
Yeah.
But I also feel, but have to, if I said to my editor, I just can't do this, he would understand.
How did you receive that news when it actually happened?
I had just come home from from reporting a story for the cover. And I flew in on a red eye that Friday morning, and purposely to meet with him before he flew to. But his assistant called me and said, please don't come in, because John if you come in, he's going to start talking. He's never going to leave on time. I'll come in on Monday instead. And you know what? I'm glad I didn't come in, because I would feel, did I hold him up from? But the truth is, what kept him from getting to the airport earlier was traffic. That's boring, right? Traffic. It wasn't some crazy reason. It was traffic in the Lincoln Tunnel. Anyway, so the plan was to meet with him on Monday about the story.
You found out at home then? You were home?
Saturday morning, 6:30 in the morning, my day-to-day editor at the magazine called and said, turn to CNN.
I understand. It's very emotional, even today, and especially with the movie. It's bringing back the memories. And actually, I'm starting to get a little teary-eyed too, because I grew up with him. Absolutely, the golden boy of Camelot, the little boy who saluted the casket.
Yep.
All right, well, okay, George shut down a few years after the tragedy, of course. It did manage to stay alive for a few years. Yeah, and then you kind of, I think you participated in an oral history with New York Magazine, and I think it was New York Magazine, maybe not. But in any case, it was something that turned into a conflict of opinion with the executive editor of George at the time.
Right.
And you left the magazine.
Yeah, you know what? Once John was gone, it just, it wasn't the magazine anymore. You know what I mean? I wished it had been because he would have liked it to continue. And in fact, when the next editor came, this man, Frank Lally, who was hired, but 6 months after John died, and he tried to make a go of it. And he called me and he said, "Please come back." And he took me to lunch at the Tess, and we had this wonderful conversation. And we walked back to the office. But do it.
It just wasn't the same. He took you to lunch at Lattès, though. You do the 90s in New York,
Right? We had expense accounts and everything. I've missed a lot. But no, really, I walked off the elevator with them, my knees buckled. I said, I can't do this. So,
yeah.
But I wished him well, and I know John would have loved nothing more than for the magazine to have continued. But as I said, I think it was a little ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm. Did it change the way you worked or looked at journalism at all? Your experience at George?
Yeah, every good editor makes you a better journalist. No question. John definitely made me a better journalist. He made me look at some things the way I might not have. Like, for instance, he would have never assigned someone a juicy story, like an investigative thing or a juicy thing on Chelsea Clinton, because kids were off limits. And I agree with that. And the old journalist in me might have said, "Oh, come on."
Right.
But I agreed with that. And so I guess he did teach me a lot of things, like, what should be hands off and what should be doggedly pursued, and he had a great appreciation for the things people might not be so aware of, like what he loved about the Little Mayor story is that he felt everyone across America could relate to that mayor, more so than you can relate to a big senator who you never meet. Do you know what I mean?
Sure,
And
or Dick Morris.
Yeah, exactly. But he understood that, like, to make politics exciting for the reader, make it accessible to the reader. And I think that's a great thing for journalists to do in general with any story they do. When I write a story, I don't write it for my editor. I write it for the reader. And that's something that John really strongly believed in. You write for the reader. And I think the stories that you read that you admire, the writer has done that. So, yeah, he taught me a lot. He had such an eye for things, and he could come up with great titles. He was a great editor. He was a great human being.
What was your favorite title?
Oh, it wasn't a story of mine, but he interviewed Dan Quayle for an issue. And everybody was in the art department, like, tossing out ideas for the title, for the cover line. He wanted to mention it on the cover. And they're, like, suggesting all these different things. And then John says, "Dumb and Dumber." John Kennedy interviews Dan Quayle. Brilliant. And that was the cover line.
Wow.
And you know what was funny, Lisa? Even if it crossed the mind of someone, they might have hesitated to say it. John said it.
You're right. He was pretty bold, I must say.
Yeah. He was a good journalist.
Which is very interesting to me, especially since I know his mother was an editor and his father had done some writing as well. But he wasn't trained in journalism. But he obviously had a connection. He had an eye. He had But speaking about doggedly pursuing stories, you certainly have done that with some other stories, the Lacey Peterson story, the Chandra Levy story, which still hasn't been solved.
Absolutely.
But Robert Durst, and he kind of got away with everything. I mean, he was convicted, but they vacated the final. He's a real estate heir who was suspected of killing 3 people, right?
Forget the vacate. He was convicted and he died convicted. He died in prison knowing.
But shortly thereafter, right? He wasn't even in prison very long.
No. I wanted him to be there longer. I wanted him to suffer in that jail cell. He died, but he died before they vacated it. So he died as a convicted murderer, as he should have.
As he should have. And he was convicted of murdering, he was suspected of 3, but he was convicted of murdering his friend, Susan Berman. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
the
right.
daughter of a gangster that you wrote about extensively. And
Yes.
you actually testified in the trial. And forgive me, but you also at that time had been recently treated for breast cancer. So here you are in this really dark story at kind of a vulnerable time in your life. How did you do that? How did that come about? And what propelled you?
I was happy to testify. Whenever I've ever been asked to it's the only testimony you give is I stand by my story. Like, you don't give up anything else. This was different. The prosecutor in Los Angeles was like a dog on a bone, like journalists are. And he called me and said, Lisa, because I wrote 2 big stories on the case. One when he killed Susan for New York Magazine, and then another one when he chopped up his next door neighbor in Galveston, which he confessed to doing on the witness stand and still got acquitted.
Because he was mentally ill. Was that the reason?
No, self-defense. He got off on self-defense. Think about this. A jury in Galveston, Texas, believed he killed his neighbor in self-defense. Okay, that's a reasonable thing. And you chopped him up in self-defense? He dismembered him and dumped him in his body parts in the Galveston Bay. A jury in Galveston said he was acquitted. You know, if I kill somebody, I'm going to Galveston. I'm doing it in Galveston.
Now, they did make a documentary. A documentary was made
Correct.
about his case, the Jinx. And I think
Okay.
a 2-part documentary. And you appeared in one of the episodes,
I appeared all throughout part 2, which was kind of recreated the from the moment at the end of Jinx 1 where Bobby Durst is on a mic that he doesn't realize is still on and goes into the men's room and says, "What did I do? Killed them all, of course." And then he gets arrested. So from that point on, the filmmakers continued with it, you know, to the story, ending with him finally being in jail, being convicted. But I was in the process of being interviewed by the filmmaker, Andrew Jarecki. We did it at this great little Italian restaurant in Philly, Ralph's. And it was an all-day thing. And midway through, I think it was our 3rd interview, all-day interview, Jarecki got a phone message. And he never took phone calls during the interview, but this one call he took. And it was Robert Durst died in his jail cell. Wow. Talk about creepy. And we both had mixed emotions about that, like Goody said, and also, he didn't suffer long enough. You know, he walked free for 20 years, a billionaire, whatever he wanted.
Makes you question what produces somebody like that in life. How did he come to be who he was? But you've certainly covered a lot of crime stories and politics.
I'm drawn to that, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think matters more to you today than it did when you were 30?
I wish I were still writing those stories, you know? Like I see one playing out somewhere and I think, ooh, you know, I wish the Glossies were still around, the ones I wrote for, you know? I wish George was still around.
Sure.
But I get back in the game now and then, you know? I'm still obsessed when a case is happening. Like, I'll watch it all on court TV. I still find it riveting. I find true crime riveting. But testifying was interesting because when the prosecutor called me, he said, I need to know who told you this. I said, that was an anonymous source. I'm not telling you. And he kept bugging me. Well, I need this. I said, John, I'm not giving up my sources. I'll go to jail before I give up my sources. Then he said something interesting to me. he said, would you go back to those sources and ask them if they would speak to me? That's interesting. Because by then Bobby was in jail. And I knew, which eventually I was able to, I knew that the reason they weren't on the record and they didn't want their name on their quotes was because they were afraid of him, and rightly so. He killed 3 people.
Maybe more.
So, but he was in jail now. So I went to the first person and said, look, I'm delivering a message. Would you want to go on the record now? And he said, yes, I would. I was shocked. And Lewis was thrilled, and he ended up being pretty much a star witness. He was one of Bobby's best friends who got on the stand and said he confessed to him. So that was worth, and the reason I had to testify in court is there was another comment that someone made, and I could not find the person. And I would say to John Lewin, I would never say male or female. I would just say, I can't find the person. And I tried every email, every address I had, every phone number, find the person. And he said to me one day, is it Beatty Roberts? And I said, I'm not answering any of your questions. He said, well, if it is, she's dead. And so then I could say now that it was, because I had to decide, would she have wanted this information that she knew to be part of the trial where he was on trial for killing her dear friend, Susan? And when I read through the notes, every time I said to her, you sure you don't want to use your name? She said, oh, Lisa, I so want to use my name, but I'm afraid of him. I'm an older woman living alone. I'm afraid of him. And so before I gave it up, I talked to her friends, and I talked to a close cousin. I said, what would Beatty want? And she said, Beatty would want the prosecutor to have this information. So that's what I testified about. It's all very emotional.
It certainly is. And you have learned so much and told so much.
Yeah.
So looking at younger journalists today, what kind of advice would you give, especially in today's world? Not a lot of glossy magazines out there, a lot of internet stuff, a lot of romanticizing of the truth and mythologizing. And what would you advise a young journalist?
To try to stick to the way of reporting. Try to stick to the basics. Like, the internet's a scary thing because you have people writing things, that aren't necessarily true. It's the advice I give students. Get to the truth, cross your T's, dot your I's. Don't, get several sources for everything you're going to print. Be old school, even though you're youngsters. It's hard. But the internet, could be a good thing. We have to make it a good thing because it's what we have.
It's with us.
Be careful. Be careful. Don't just throw things out there that you're not sure of. Because if you throw out things that aren't facts in a story that should be factual, it never goes away on the internet. So I do kind of tell students that. I taught journalism for a while at NYU. Yes, get it right.
Well, I hope they took your advice.
I hope. They are. The ones that are making it are. Okay, a couple of my students write for the New York Times, and I'm very proud of them. So, but it's hard. I think it's harder to make it in this business today than it was in my day. Because they pay crap on the internet. It's hard. It's very hard. The days that I rode the good times, you remember, like it was, God, expensive cars and drivers. God, that's all gone.
It is all gone. Well, hopefully there is a good horizon out there for some journalists, and not just looking backwards. Yeah. Yeah.
I do like the attitude of some of these youngsters. Like, they want to do it,
They do. You're right.
So, and I'm very encouraging. Very encouraging.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. I mean, I know we could talk even further. We could talk about AI.
Oh, God, don't, please.
Okay.
You already got me crying once. I'll be crying again.
Anyway, you've had a remarkable journey, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. We wish you well.
Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. This podcast has been brought to you by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business that supports people who follow through on their dreams. Harmony Talk airs at 4:30 p.m. on Sundays at WVIA, and you can find all of our episodes at HarmonyTALKpodcast.com. I'm Lisa Champeau. Thanks for spending time with us, Lisa Depalo, and all of you out there. Keep on dreaming.